On Christmas Eve of 2003, 5 members of the Matthews family disappeared into the fog along the Columbia Gorge and were never seen alive again. A father, a mother, and 3 children left their Portland home in a green Ford Explorer. Within 2 hours they were caught on 2 security cameras, once at a gas station and once inside a café. After 9 o'clock that night, the trail ended. No phone calls, no bank activity, no vehicle. For nearly 20 years, Oregon lived with a haunting silence. Some believed the SUV had slipped into the icy river. Others whispered of a crime carefully hidden in the darkness of Christmas Eve. How could an entire family vanish without leaving a trace on one of the busiest highways in the state? And who was the man in the corner of that Hood River Café whose eyes never left David Matthews? If you want to uncover these questions and follow this case to its chilling end, then like this video, subscribe to Unscripted Tales, turn on the bell icon, and tell me in the comments which city you are watching from. Let us reach 5,000 likes on this story and keep alive the pursuit of answers. That evening, while neighbors prepared for holiday meals, the Matthews family quietly readied their own simple plan. David Matthews, 38, stood outside in the drizzle, tall but worn from weeks of work. Checking the Ford Explorer's tires, Karen Matthews, 36, tenderly adjusted her youngest daughter's red scarf, tucking it against the cold. Their 12-year-old son and 9-year-old daughter laughed and argued about what gifts might be waiting under the tree by morning. They packed snacks and a few thin blankets into the back of the SUV, then climbed inside. With the turn of a key, the engine's growl pierced the mist. Headlights cut through the wet air, and the Explorer rolled out of their street, lined with glowing decorations. Behind them, the small house stood waiting for a family that would never return. The Explorer moved eastward through the curtain of fog until its headlights cut across a small gas station in Troutdale. At exactly 7:15 p.m., a receipt would later confirm the stop. Locking the Matthews family to a moment in time, the security camera above the pump was old and blurry, but it still caught enough. A tall figure stepped out to fuel the SUV shoulders, squared against the cold. That was David. Beside him, a woman in a pale coat moved around the vehicle, wiping the damp glass so her husband could see more clearly. That was Karen. Inside the car, the children fidgeted in their winter layers, pressing hands against the fogging windows, shifting in their seats, restless from the long day. One leaned close to the glass and wiped a small circle with the palm of a hand, eyes shining through the mist for only a moment before disappearing again. The stop was brief and ordinary. The kind of forgettable pause countless families made on countless nights. A card swipe, a nozzle hung back on the pump, a folded receipt tucked into a wallet. Yet this was not just another stop. It became one of the last undeniable footprints left by the Matthews family. Beyond this receipt and this grainy clip, the trail would soon blur into silence. But after Troutdale, the Explorer did not go straight into the dark river road. It turned toward one final stop, a warm place where strangers noticed things that would never be forgotten. From Troutdale, the Explorer pressed eastward, hugging the edge of the Columbia River as rain tapped against its windows. Around 8 p.m., its headlights pulled into a small café in Hood River, a warm and quiet stop along the highway. Inside, the smell of roasted coffee mixed with the soft hum of travelers passing through. The Matthews family stepped in from the wet, nightcoats dripping, cheeks flushed from the cold. Karen guided the youngest toward a bench near the wall, gently brushing damp hair from her face. The older 2 children huddled beside her, whispering and giggling, their eyes fixed on the display of cookies by the counter. David approached the register with a faint smile, making easy conversation with the barista as he ordered 2 cappuccinos to take on the road. For a brief moment, they looked like any other family, pausing on their way to celebrate Christmas at home. But not everyone in that room was simply passing time. At a corner table sat a solitary man. His shoulders were broad beneath a dark jacket, his hair short, a baseball cap shadowing his face. He barely touched his coffee, slowly turning the cup in his hands. His eyes fixed on David Matthews with a look that unsettled those who later recalled it. It was not the glance of a curious Stranger. It was a stare, long and cold. As though weighing every move David made, by 9 p.m., the family gathered their cups, pulled their coats close, and stepped back into the thick fog. Doors opened and closed in quick rhythm. The engine of the Explorer rumbled to life, its headlights cut across the wet pavement, then faded into the mist as it merged back onto the highway. Inside the café, conversations resumed, chairs scraped the floor, and the corner table where the man had sat was empty. That was the final time anyone saw the Matthews family alive. And soon after those headlights dissolved into the fog, the trail went dark. The doors of the Hood River Café closed behind the Matthews family, and outside the fog had thickened into a heavy curtain that swallowed sound and light. Their Ford Explorer rolled across the wet pavement, headlights carving a short path through the darkness before dissolving into the mist. The SUV merged onto the highway, its taillights blinking faintly as it joined the thin stream of Christmas EV traffic that hugged the Columbia River. From that moment, the road became their last witness. The family did not appear on any other cameras, no more receipts marked their presence, and no phone calls were made. Their credit cards stayed silent, their cell phones went dark, and no driver reported a vehicle matching theirs pulled over. Along the interstate, in less than an hour, every trace of the Matthews family seemed to vanish into thin air. What followed was an absence so complete that it unsettled even the most seasoned investigators. How could a car as large as a Ford Explorer disappear without a trace on one of the most traveled highways in the state? And how could an entire family be erased in the span of a single foggy night? By the next morning, someone close to them would realize that silence had stretched too long, and that something terrible had happened. Christmas morning arrived, and, while homes across Portland filled with the sound of wrapping paper and laughter, one house on a quiet street stood strangely silent. Its porch lights still glowed with holiday decorations, but no voices came from within. Rebecca Collins, Karen's sister, picked up her phone to wish the family a Merry Christmas. The line rang again and again without an answer. She tried the house phone. She tried Karen's cell phone. Nothing but endless ringing met her ears. By the afternoon, unease turned into dread. Rebecca's hands trembled as she dialed the Portland police. With a breaking voice, she explained that her sister, her brother, and their 3 children had not been seen or heard from since the previous night. The call set in motion a chain of urgency that would grow by the hour. That evening, at Multnomah County headquarters, cold fluorescent lights lit up a room crowded with officers. A large map of Oregon stretched across the table. Red pins marked the family's route from Portland to Troutdale, from Troutdale to Hood River, and then east toward the Dalles. Every officer knew the truth that hung over the room. An entire family of 5, including 3 children, had gone missing on Christmas Eve. Each passing hour cut into the already fragile hope of finding them alive. The lead investigator reminded the team of a rule they all understood well. If no strong lead appears within the first 72 hours, the chances of recovery fall sharply. The tension in the room was heavy. Officers scribbled notes, assignments were shouted across the table, and the hunt began. Soon, the sky's over. Portland would carry the beat of helicopter blades, and the cold banks of the Columbia would be lined with searchers pushing through the fog. By the first light of Christmas morning, the search was already in motion. A helicopter lifted from Troutdale Airport, its spotlight slicing through the thick fog as it followed Interstate 84 along the Columbia River. From the air, the gorge looked like a vast ribbon of gray water hemmed in by steep cliffs. Every curve of the highway was scanned, every riverside pullout examined, but nothing unusual appeared below. Only parked trucks and empty lots broke the monotony of the road. On the ground, officers moved slowly along the icy banks. Heavy rain gear pulled tight as flashlights swept through the brush. They peered into ditches and crevices, calling out over the sound of rushing water. K-29 units sniffed the roadside, trained noses pulling their handlers forward. At one point, the dogs barked furiously near a damp patch of asphalt, raising a flicker of hope, but a quick test revealed it was nothing more than residue from passing trucks. By the evening, Divers entered the freezing river near dangerous curves of the highway. Ropes and oxygen tanks kept them tethered against the violent current. Visibility under the surface was less than a meter. They felt their way through the darkness, hands brushing rocks, debris, and sunken branches. When they surfaced, faces pale from the cold, they reported nothing but old scraps of metal and tangled fishing nets. No trace of the explorer. No trace of the Matthews family. Days of searching passed. Helicopters roared through rain-filled skies. Officers pressed through mud and undergrowth. Divers risked their lives in water that seemed determined to hide its secrets. And yet, not a single clue tied to the missing family was found. It was during the review of this fruitless search that investigators began to question whether the Matthews family had truly met with an accident, or whether something far more deliberate had taken place. When the exhausting searches across land, air, and river returned with empty hands, investigators turned back to the evidence already in their possession. The first solid marker was the Troutdale gas station. Receipt at 7:15 p.m., that slip of paper confirmed the Explorer was filled to the top. The grainy security footage from the same stop showed David at the pump, Karen wiping condensation from the windows, and 3 restless children moving inside the vehicle. That moment was locked, in fact. The second marker was the Hood River Café, where the family appeared less than an hour later. Witnesses remembered their coats dripping with rain, the children staring at cookies behind the glass, and David smiling politely at the counter, but the camera system inside that small roadside cafe was outdated. By the time investigators asked for the tapes, the footage had already been overwritten. Those final frames of the Matthews family walking back into the fog were gone forever. Beyond 8:45 p.m., the trail ended like a door slammed shut. No further card use appeared in financial records. No calls or text messages were traced from their phones. Not a single bank log, phone ping, or electronic footprint suggested that the family continued on their journey. It was as if the Matthews family simply evaporated after they left Hood River. This silence pressed heavily on the investigation. Officers filled their reports with times and notes, but every line ended without resolution. An entire family vanished, and all that remained were 2 small fragments of evidence and a growing unease that something more than chance was at play. It was during this uneasy lull that detectives began to voice a darker thought, a possibility that what happened that night was not an accident at all. The more investigators studied the thin trail left behind, the more divided their thoughts became. Some officers leaned toward the simplest explanation. The Matthews family had likely lost control of their vehicle along Interstate 84, a treacherous road that clings to the side of the Columbia River. In heavy fog and slick rain, one slip of the wheel could have sent the Explorer plunging into the water. The absence of skid marks or debris did not rule it out, because the river was wide and violent enough to swallow an entire vehicle without leaving much behind. But others in the room grew restless with that theory. The family was seen leaving the cafe calm and collected, their vehicle in good condition, their tank full. No one reported a crash sound, no one reported wreckage along the roadside, and no oil slicks or tire shreds surfaced on the water. The more seasoned detectives began asking harder questions. If this was not an accident, then what was it? Could the family have been followed? Could someone have forced them off the road deliberately? That possibility unsettled everyone. But it also explained what the evidence did not. An accident might leave scraps or a signal. A crime carried out with intent could leave silence. And in that silence, suspicion slowly grew. One detail from the Hood River Cafe lingered in reports. The image of a man sitting alone, staring at David Matthews with a cold and calculating look. That memory would soon become the spark for an entirely new direction in the investigation. The theory of an accident was still on the table, but it was the memory of one cafe worker that shifted the atmosphere of the investigation. A waitress from Hood River remembered the Matthews family clearly, not because they did anything unusual, but because of the way someone else in the room behaved. She recalled a man who sat alone at a corner table. He was stocky, with short brown hair, a baseball cap pulled low over his face, and a presence that made her uneasy. While the Matthews children whispered and giggled at the counter display, this man never looked away from their father. His eyes, she explained, followed David Matthews with an intensity that was not casual curiosity. He gripped his coffee cup so tightly that his knuckles turned pale, yet he never lifted it to drink. To her, it felt as if he was calculating something, waiting for the right moment. By the time the family gathered their drinks and stepped into the fog, she glanced back toward the corner table. The man was gone. No one noticed him leave. His chair sat empty, and his untouched cup remained on the table. That single detail was enough to unsettle the entire investigative team. A sketch artist was brought in, and with the waitress's guidance, a vague outline of the stranger took shape. The face was broad, the cap drawn low, the eyes shadowed. It was enough to create unease, but not enough for a clear identification. When the drawing was run through police databases, no solid matches appeared. The man seemed to vanish just as easily as the Matthews family. With no name and no record, the sketch was pinned to the board in the command room. A reminder that someone in that cafe might have been the last person to watch the family alive. And while the stranger remained only a shadow, investigators could not shake the thought that he may have followed them into the night. The sketch of the mysterious man pinned to the board was a haunting reminder. But without a name or solid proof, the investigation could not rest on shadows alone. Detectives turned back to the Columbia River, believing that if the Matthews family had vanished after leaving the cafe, the water itself might be holding the truth. The Columbia is vast, cold, and merciless. Its currents run fast, strong enough to pull down entire vehicles and hide them in its depths. On December 30th, divers were sent to the Dalles Marina, a place marked for its sharp curves and history of tragic accidents. The fog clung low to the water as rescue boats dropped anchor. Divers in heavy suits adjusted their oxygen tanks, ropes tied firmly around their waists, before lowering themselves into the freezing current. Below the surface, the world turned to darkness. Visibility was barely the length of an arm. The divers worked by feel, brushing against rocks, tangled branches, and long-forgotten debris. Their flashlights cut only narrow beams into the murky green water. Every so often, a burst of bubbles broke the surface. The only sign that someone was still moving below. After hours of effort, the teams returned pale and shivering, reporting what they had found. An old tire wedged between rocks, fragments of metal, abandoned fishing nets, but nothing that matched the size or shape of a Ford Explorer. The report that landed on the command desk was brief and grim. No signs of the Matthews vehicle. Strong current may have carried it far downstream. The chilling note left at the bottom of the page silenced the room. If the car had been pushed into the river, it might now lie miles away in unreachable waters. And if the river had swallowed it whole, the family could remain hidden for decades. Yet even as the Columbia refused to give up its secrets, suspicion began to settle closer to home, toward someone who had reason to wish David Matthews harm. As the Columbia River kept its silence, investigators turned their eyes back to the neighborhood the Matthews family once called home. There a name rose again and again in interviews. Charles Dawson, known to most as Chuck, lived only 3 houses down. He was in his mid-40s, stocky, often out of work, and carried the reputation of a man always chasing money. Records showed that Dawson had borrowed $15,000 from David Matthews for a small construction project that failed quickly. The debt went unpaid, and tension began to grow between the two men. Neighbors remembered the arguments. One in particular echoed down the quiet street in the fall of 2003. Voices rose. Sharp words carried through the air, and Dawson was heard, shouting a chilling warning. "You will regret underestimating me." That threat, once brushed aside as anger in the heat of the moment, now took on new weight. On January 2, 2004, detectives knocked on Dawson's door. He answered with bloodshot eyes, unshaven, and irritated. When asked about Christmas Eve, Dawson claimed he had been home alone, drinking beer and watching football. No one could confirm his story. No visitors, no witnesses, no details beyond his own word. The detectives pressed him about the debt. His face hardened, his tone sharp. "Yes, I owed him money, but that does not mean I killed anyone." When asked about the loud argument, he dismissed it as nothing more than normal guy stuff. His answers wavered between defensive and dismissive. Yet not a single piece of physical evidence tied him directly to the Matthews disappearance. A search of his home and his pickup truck revealed nothing suspicious. The report that followed placed Dawson as a possible suspect. He had motive, he had made threats, and he had no solid alibi. But with nothing concrete to hold him, the law could not move further. Dawson remained free, even as suspicion thickened around his name. While he returned to his daily life, even attending vigils for the missing family, the question haunted the community. Was their friendly neighbor hiding a secret darker than anyone dared to believe? The first weeks of the new year brought nothing but dead ends. Suspicion surrounded Charles Dawson, yet without evidence, the case could not move forward. As winter turned to spring, the search slowed, and soon the Matthews family's disappearance slipped from the headlines. What had once shaken Oregon began to fade beneath newer stories, fresher tragedies, and shifting priorities. Still, Rebecca Collins, Karen's sister, refused to let the memory of her family sink into silence. She organized candlelight vigils in front of Portland City Hall, standing with photos of David, Karen, and the children held high. At first, hundreds gathered. Neighbors, classmates, strangers who felt the weight of a family gone without explanation. They lit white candles, their glow reflecting against Rebecca's tearful face as she begged the community not to forget. But, as the years passed, the crowd grew thinner. Dozens remained where once there had been hundreds. And Rebecca's voice carried into smaller and smaller gatherings. Inside the police force, frustration mounted. Hundreds of hours had been poured into helicopter sweeps, ground searches, and divers risking their lives in the Columbia. The budget strained, other cases demanded attention, and slowly the Matthews file was pushed aside. By 2007, funding for further search efforts was cut. The official words were heavy with defeat. All leads exhausted. Investigation suspended pending new evidence. In 2008, 5 years after the family vanished, the file was transferred to the Oregon State Police Cold Case Unit. A simple note was added to its cover. Matthews case, cold, awaiting future review. For many, it was the closing of a door, a quiet admission that time had buried whatever answers once lay within reach. Yet even as the folder gathered dust, some who had worked the case carried a lingering belief. The Matthews family had not been lost by accident. They had been silenced by design, and it would take the right spark years later to bring that truth back into the light. For years, the Matthews file sat in the cold case shelves, the ink fading and the paper stiffening with time. But in 2013, a full decade after the disappearance, the case returned to the public eye. The Oregonian launched a series on unsolved crimes across the state, and at the very top of their list was the Matthews family. Reporter Rachel Morris sought out those who had worked the case in its earliest days. One of them was Daniel Price, the lead detective, back in 2003, now retired. His hair white and his frame leaner, Price still carried the weight of the Matthews disappearance in his eyes. Over coffee at his small home near Salem, he confessed that this case had haunted him more than any other. He spoke about the frantic searches, the helicopters sweeping the gorge, the divers battling currents they could barely fight against. But then his voice lowered, as he recalled something that never left his mind. A witness at the Hood River Café had described a man sitting alone, broad-shouldered, brown-haired, wearing a baseball cap. The man stared at David Matthews with an unsettling intensity before vanishing without anyone noticing. Price admitted that he always suspected the man could have been Charles Dawson, the neighbor with a $15,000 debt, the same man who had publicly shouted threats at David only months earlier. At the time, the lead went nowhere because the cafe footage had been overwritten. Without video proof, prosecutors would not move forward. But to Price, the connection was too close to ignore. When the Oregonian published the article, it reignited the case in the public's memory. The headline read, "Retired detective reveals overlooked detail in Matthews' disappearance." Suspicion flared once more around Charles Dawson. Communities whispered. Neighbors remembered. Rebecca Collins, still holding vigils every year, read the article and broke down in tears. She told a reporter that she had always believed Dawson was involved, and now the world finally saw what she had feared for 10 long years. The story spread across Oregon, pulling the case back into light. And while many felt the same frustration that evidence had been overlooked, others began to wonder if new technology might someday uncover what the river and the years had hidden. The Oregonian article kept the Matthews family in public memory for a time, but years passed once again, and the case began to slip back into the shadows. Then, in the fall of 2019, a group of civilian divers breathed new life into the mystery. Oregon Underwater Recovery, a volunteer team of explorers, often spent their weekends scanning the depths of the Columbia River with modern sonar equipment. For them, finding lost vehicles and sunken debris was a mission of service. For one diver, Mark Hensley, it was also personal. He had grown up in the same neighborhood as the Matthews family, and had never forgotten the eerie silence that fell over Portland in December 2003. On September 14th, beneath an overcast sky, Hensley and his team launched their boat near the Dalles Marina. Unlike the limited gear of 2003, they carried advanced side-scan sonar, capable of producing detailed three-dimensional images of the riverbed. The screen flickered with shapes of rocks, fallen trees, and wreckage long forgotten. Hours passed with little to note until a sudden shadow appeared. The sonar revealed a boxy shape, nearly 4 meters long and 2 meters wide. 4 round outlines extended from its corners, like wheels buried in the mud. The divers knew instantly what they were seeing. This was no natural formation. It was the outline of a vehicle, trapped beneath 70 feet of icy water. Measurements matched the size of a Ford Explorer from the early 2000s. The team marked the exact GPS coordinates and scanned the area repeatedly to be certain. Each pass confirmed the same shape, tilted and half-sunken, but unmistakably a car. No one said the words aloud at first, but the weight of the discovery pressed down on every person on that boat. After 16 years of silence, the Matthews family might finally have been found. The following day, Oregon State Police received the report, complete with sonar images and coordinates. For the first time since Christmas Eve of 2003, there was a solid lead. And with it, came the grim knowledge that whatever answers remained were waiting in the dark water below. Nearly 2 years after the civilian dive team handed over their coordinates, the Columbia River finally gave up its secret. In May of 2021, under gray skies and restless winds, Oregon State Police gathered at the Dalles Marina with forensic experts, divers, and a floating crane prepared for a recovery mission that had been delayed for almost 18 years. The divers descended first, their flashlights cutting through the murky water until they touched metal. Mud and algae coated the frame, but the tilted outline confirmed it. This was a vehicle. Ropes and steel cables were secured, wrapped tightly around the battered shell, and slowly the winch above began to tighten. Minutes stretched like hours as bubbles and silt erupted to the surface. Then, with a roar of machinery, the river released what it had kept hidden. A rusted SUV emerged, dripping with water and tangled in weeds. Tarps were quickly raised to block the view from waiting reporters, but inside, the team saw enough. License plate was scrubbed free of mud, its numbers reading clearly, Oregon 3, W592. It was the Matthews family Ford Explorer. When the doors were forced open, a heavy stench of river mud and decay poured out. Within the sludge, small fragments began to appear. Bone fragments, a child's shoe with frayed laces, a decayed teddy bear, and a silver ring that Karen Matthews had worn for years. Each piece was a heartbreaking confirmation that the family had been inside the vehicle since that night. Forensic teams noted details that carried disturbing weight. The airbags at the front had never deployed, suggesting no crash impact had triggered them. And at the rear of the SUV, The door lock showed deep scratches and deformation. Under magnification, the damage pointed to force from outside, as if a crowbar had pried it. The chilling conclusion grew clearer with every observation. This was no tragic accident on a foggy night. The Explorer had been pushed into the river, its passengers trapped inside, with the vehicle raised and the truth beginning to take shape. Investigators faced a painful certainty. Someone had murdered the Matthews family, and the evidence to prove it had been preserved beneath the Columbia for nearly 2 decades. Once the Explorer was pulled from the Columbia, it was carefully sealed and transported to the Oregon State Forensic Lab in Salem. Under bright fluorescent lights, the vehicle that had been hidden for 18 years was placed on a sterile floor, its rusted shell surrounded by teams of experts in protective suits. Every door, every seat, every scrap of mud was treated as a possible clue. Inside, the sludge was removed, piece by piece. From it came fragments of bone, later matched through DNA testing to David, Karen, and their 3 children. The results left no doubt. The Matthews family had never left that SUV. Their journey had ended in the river on that foggy Christmas Eve night. Yet the evidence told an even darker story. On the rear seat, technicians uncovered a deep brown stain. Chemical tests confirmed it was blood. DNA matched it to the 9-year-old son. That detail suggested that an injury had occurred before the vehicle entered the water, pointing toward a violent struggle. Mechanical experts studied the structure of the SUV with equal care. The airbags in the front had never deployed, a fact that shattered the idea of an accidental crash. If the Explorer had struck the water at high speed, sensors would have triggered the system. Instead, it appeared the vehicle was rolled or pushed in without enough force to activate them. At the rear, the lock and latch bore marks impossible to dismiss. Scratches cut across the metal, bending inward as though pried by an external tool. To the eyes of the forensic team, it was evidence of someone sealing the vehicle before it went under. The report that followed carried words that closed one chapter of uncertainty and opened another of grim truth. This was not an accident. It was homicide. 5 lives taken, concealed beneath the Columbia. Their story silenced for nearly 2 decades. And with that official ruling, the question that had haunted Oregon returned with greater force than ever. Who had done this, and why had they waited so long to be unmasked? With the case officially ruled a homicide, the file was pulled out of cold storage and handed to a new generation of investigators. The responsibility fell to Megan Hartley, a 32-year-old detective known for her sharp focus and relentless drive. She stepped into a small office crowded with dusty boxes, yellowed reports, and photographs faded by time. On the wall, she pinned a large whiteboard and began reconstructing the family's final hours piece by piece. She marked the gas station, the café, the unexplained disappearance, the diver's discovery, and now the forensic proof of murder. Lines connected names, notes, and fragments of testimony. One name appeared again and again. Charles Dawson, the neighbor who owed David $15,000. The man who argued loudly in the street and threatened him months before the family vanished. The man, some believed, was spotted at the Hood River Café. Hartley circled his name boldly, determined not to let the case stall like it had before. Hartley requested a full forensic recheck of the Explorer using modern technology. Technicians treated the rusted surfaces with chemicals that revealed what time and water had hidden. Under ultraviolet light, faint ridges appeared across the metal of the rear door. They were fingerprints. When entered into the database, the system flashed a near-perfect match. Charles Dawson. For nearly 2 decades, his name had lingered only as suspicion. Now, his touch was marked directly on the vehicle that carried the Matthews family to their deaths. The evidence shifted the case from shadows to substance. And with Dawson's fingerprints exposed, investigators knew the long quiet neighbor was no longer just a possibility. He was at the very heart of the tragedy. With Dawson's fingerprints confirmed on the Explorer, Detective Hartley knew she needed more than science. She needed a human voice that tied him to the family's final night. Her search led her back to the Hood River Café, To the waitress who had first spoken of a man staring at David Matthews with unsettling focus. Her name was Linda Carver. Nearly 2 decades had passed since that Christmas Eve shift, and Linda now lived quietly in a small town near Bend. Hartley visited her home on a quiet August morning in 2021. The woman greeted her with tired eyes, but an eagerness that revealed she had been waiting for someone to finally listen. Sitting on her porch with trembling hands wrapped around a cup of tea, Linda recalled the night in chilling detail. She remembered the Matthews children huddled together on a bench, the steam rising from their coats, and Karen guiding the youngest by the hand. But her attention was drawn to a man in the corner, broad-shouldered, brown-haired, his baseball cap shadowing his face. He never touched his drink, he only stared at David Matthews. His grip on the coffee cup was so tight his knuckles turned white. His eyes, Linda said, were filled with something darker than curiosity. When Hartley gently showed her an old photo of Charles Dawson from 2003, Linda's reaction was immediate. She nodded, her voice steady despite the emotion in her face. That was him. I will never forget those eyes. She added that when the family left, the man's chair was suddenly empty. He had slipped out unseen, as if following them into the storm. For Hartley, this was the missing link she had been searching for. Dawson was no longer just a name on paper or a fingerprint on metal. He was the man who watched the family in their final public moments. A predator hiding in plain sight, and now, with a living witness and physical evidence aligning the case against Dawson was tightening into a noose. The fingerprints on the Explorer and Linda Carver's testimony placed Dawson closer to the truth than ever before, but Detective Hartley knew that a case of this weight needed one more solid link. As she sifted through old evidence logs, a forgotten note caught her eye. In February 2004, just weeks after the Matthews vanished, a fisherman had pulled a revolver from the banks of the Columbia. At the time, investigators dismissed it as unrelated. Logging it away in a box marked miscellaneous. Hartley immediately ordered the item brought out of storage. The box was covered in dust, its label nearly faded, but inside lay a revolver caked in rust, its wooden grip warped from years of water damage. Back in 2004, technology had been too limited to draw anything useful from it. Now, with modern imaging and chemical treatments, even the faintest traces could be revealed. At the lab, technicians carefully treated the corroded surface. Piece by piece, the rust gave way, and faint patterns began to emerge. Under magnification, ridges of a fingerprint appeared. Though incomplete, the analysis software processed the data. The result flashed across the screen. A partial match. Confidence level, 87%. Charles Dawson. It was not a full print, but paired with everything else, it carried enormous weight. Dawson's fingerprint on the Explorer's rear door. His presence confirmed at the café. And now, his partial print found on a revolver pulled from the very river that swallowed the Matthews family. For nearly 2 decades, he had lived as a shadow. Attending vigils, shaking hands, walking freely in the same community that mourned the loss. But the rusted gun whispered what the water had tried to erase. Dawson had left his mark not just on the car, but on the weapon discarded nearby. And with this discovery, the case against him grew too strong to ignore. It was no longer a matter of suspicion. It was becoming a matter of justice waiting to strike. With the fingerprints, the revolver, and the witness testimony building a powerful chain of evidence, investigators brought Charles Dawson into the interrogation room. The air inside was heavy, the fluorescent lights glaring off the metal table where files and photographs waited. Dawson entered with a defiant look, arms crossed, as if he had weathered this storm before. Detective Hartley sat across from him, calm and steady. She placed a photograph of the Explorer's rear door on the table, the ultraviolet glow revealing his fingerprint. Dawson scoffed, saying he had lived near the Matthews family for years. Perhaps he had touched their car at some point. Hartley said nothing, simply laying down the next photograph. The rusted revolver. Dawson shifted uncomfortably, insisting he had never owned a gun. Then Hartley changed her tone. She leaned forward and spoke of the smallest detail. The red wool scarf, the youngest Matthews child had worn into the café on Christmas Eve. For a moment, Dawson blinked, then muttered that the scarf had slipped to the floor of the car. The room fell silent. Hartley froze, her eyes locking on his. That detail had never been released publicly. The scarf had been found inside the Explorer during the forensic sweep, buried in river mud. Only someone who had been inside that car when it went under would know its final position. Realizing his slip, Dawson's face flushed. He slammed a fist on the table, claiming he had heard about it from someone else, but the damage was done. The interrogators knew they had struck the deepest crack in his defense. The red scarf was not just a child's lost clothing, it was the thread that revealed his presence in the vehicle on that night of horror, and now the walls were closing in on him, leaving no space to run from. What he had carried in silence for 18 years, the red scarf slip, had sealed what the fingerprints and the revolver had already built. Prosecutors moved quickly, and in August of 2023, Oregon State Police finally acted. Charles Dawson was arrested at his home, charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of David and Karen Matthews and their 3 children. After 20 long years, the neighbor who once sat quietly at vigils was now led away in handcuffs, his head lowered under flashing lights. Within hours, the Salem headquarters of the Oregon State Police filled with reporters. Cameras crowded the room, microphones extended, and the air was tense with expectation. The police chief stood at the podium, his voice firm as he declared that the Matthews case had reached a turning point. After nearly 2 decades, justice was no longer a question, but a reality. When Detective Hartley stepped forward, the room hushed. She spoke with calm determination, explaining that modern forensic science, persistent investigation, and the courage of witnesses had finally brought truth to light. She reminded the public that no case is too old, no crime too deeply hidden. If the pursuit of justice continues. Then came Rebecca Collins, her face drawn with years of grief, her voice breaking as she held a photograph of her sister and nieces and nephew. She told the gathered crowd that 20 Christmases had passed in silence, each one a wound that never closed. And though nothing could bring them back, knowing that the man responsible was behind bars brought her a fragile measure of peace. The room erupted in applause. Not only for Rebecca, but for the decades of persistence that had refused to let the Matthews name fade into history. And as the press conference closed, Oregon knew that this story was not only about loss, but about a community that had carried the weight of silence for too long. Yet while the arrest brought answers, the courtroom battle that followed would test whether the evidence could withstand the final fight for justice, with Dawson behind bars. The case moved into its final and most critical stage. The courtroom battle. Prosecutors in Wasco County began building what they called an airtight case. Files were stacked high, evidence photos arranged in sequence, and witness lists carefully prepared. Every piece of forensic proof was reviewed again and again. The fingerprints on the rear door, the partial prints on the revolver, the blood of the 9-year-old boy on the back seat, and the red scarf detail that only Dawson could have known. Detective Hartley worked side by side with the prosecutors, walking them through the timeline she had reconstructed. The gas station receipt, the cafe sighting, the vanishing, the silent years, and then the recovery of the Explorer from the Columbia. Each detail was connected like a chain, designed to leave no gap for the defense to exploit. Dawson's lawyers clung tightly to a single lifeline. They argued that this was never murder, only a tragic accident. They claimed Dawson might have argued with David, but never intended to harm the family. According to them, on a cold and foggy night, the Explorer could have slipped off the road. On its own, it was a theory aimed at planting doubt in the minds of jurors, but prosecutors prepared counter after counter. They used 3-dimensional computer models to simulate the path of the Explorer, showing that without external force, the vehicle would not have entered the water in the way it was found. Weather reports from that night were also pulled, proving that while it was foggy and wet, the conditions were not severe enough to explain such a slide. Experts explained that the airbags had never deployed because there had been no crash, only a deliberate push. The more the evidence was tested, the stronger it held. And as the date for trial drew closer, one truth became clear. The courtroom would not only decide Dawson's fate, it would also decide whether the Matthews family's story ended in silence or injustice by March of 2024. The Wasco County Courthouse became the center of national attention. Crowds gathered outside, cameras lined the steps, and the trial of Charles Dawson was called one of the most important murder cases in Oregon's history. Inside, the jury sat tense and silent as the prosecution began presenting the story that had taken 2 decades to piece together. The witnesses were called one by one. When Linda Carver, the retired waitress, took the stand, she looked fragile but determined. Her voice carried through the courtroom as she described the man in the corner of the Hood River Café. His eyes locked on David Matthews with cold intensity. She pointed to Dawson, sitting just feet away, and confirmed without hesitation that he was the man she had seen. Her testimony brought a wave of murmurs across the gallery. Next came the forensic experts. They displayed photographs of the explorer's rear door under ultraviolet light, showing Dawson's fingerprints glowing against the rusted frame. They explained the mechanics of the airbags, proving they never deployed because there had been no crash. They pointed to the scratches and warped lock at the back, evidence of an external force sealing the family inside. The most chilling moment was when they revealed the DNA results from the rear seat. The blood of the 9-year-old boy was found, soaked deep into the fabric, a sign of harm before the car ever touched the water. Finally, the prosecution played Dawson's own interrogation audio, the moment where he slipped, speaking about the youngest child's red scarf lying on the car floor. The jury listened in silence, and when the words echoed through the courtroom, the defense lawyers shifted uneasily. That detail had never been released to the public. It was the moment the mask slipped. The defense tried to cling to their accident theory, but their arguments cracked under the mountain of evidence. Each claim was countered, each theory dismantled, until their case stood hollow and broken. And as Dawson sat at the defense table, his face red with anger, the jury could see not the image of a misunderstood neighbor, but a man cornered by truth. After 2 long weeks of testimony, photographs, and emotional accounts, the jury finally withdrew to deliberate. The courthouse fell into a heavy silence as hours turned into days. On the 3rd evening, word spread that the jury had reached a decision. Crowds gathered outside, candles in hand, waiting for the moment that had taken 2 decades to arrive. Inside the packed courtroom, Charles Dawson sat with his head low, his hands clenched tightly on the defense table. Rebecca Collins clutched a worn photograph of her sister's family, tears welling in her eyes. The judge called for order, and the jury foreperson rose. The verdict was read slowly, each word striking like a hammer. Guilty, 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 on all 5 counts of first-degree murder. Gasps filled the room. Some wept openly. Others nodded in quiet relief. Dawson slumped back in his chair, his face pale, as though the weight of years hiding in plain sight had finally crushed him. The judge then delivered the sentence. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the first time in 20 years, the Matthews family's silence had found its answer. Rebecca Collins was invited to speak. She rose slowly, holding the family photograph close to her chest. Her voice trembled but carried through the room. She said 20 Christmases had passed in darkness, with empty chairs and unanswered prayers. She said her sister Karen, her brother-in-law David, and the children deserved to be remembered, not for how they were taken, but for the love they carried in life. And now, with justice spoken aloud, she could finally whisper to them that they were no longer forgotten. The courtroom rose in a standing ovation. Some jurors wiped their eyes. Reporters scribbled frantically. Outside, the crowd erupted as the news spread across Oregon and beyond. Dawson was led away in chains, and Rebecca stood quietly by the courthouse steps, breathing in the cold evening air with a fragile peace at last. But though the verdict closed the case, the legacy of the Matthews family would continue to echo across Oregon, carried by those who refused to let their story fade. The trial had ended. Dawson was locked away for life, and Oregon slowly began to breathe again. But the story of the Matthews family did not close with the verdict. In late 2024, a granite memorial was raised near the Dalles Marina, the very place where the explorer had been pulled from the water. The stone bore only a simple inscription: Matthews family. December 24, 2003, never forgotten. Visitors came, quietly, leaving flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. Their reflections caught in the restless waters of the Columbia. The case soon became more than a tragedy. It became a lesson. Across the state, police academies began teaching the Matthews file as an example of why no cold case should ever be abandoned. Forensic instructors pointed to how sonar, DNA technology, and patient persistence had taken a case thought lost and turned it into one of the most powerful convictions in Oregon's history. Asterisk Detective Megan Hartley, now a name respected far beyond her unit, was invited to speak at a statewide police conference in Salem. Standing before a hall of young recruits, she spoke plainly. She said no case is too old, no victim deserves to be forgotten, and justice delayed is still justice, if pursued with persistence. Her words were met with a standing ovation, and many officers carried them like a vow into their own careers. For Rebecca Collins, the sister who had carried the flame for 20 silent years, peace finally began to take shape. At the memorial, she laid white flowers and whispered that her family could finally rest. Their names no longer lost to unanswered questions. The community that once trembled under mystery now stood united under a truth. A truth that had taken 2 decades to uncover, but had proven that even time cannot bury justice. As the Columbia Gorge stood quiet under an autumn sunset, the legacy of the Matthews family became more than a story of loss. It became a reminder, etched into Oregon's memory, that persistence, truth, and community can pull even the darkest secrets from the depths. The Matthews Wise family story is not only a tale of loss, but also a reminder of the shadows that can live right next door. A friendly wave from a neighbor may hide a darker truth, and sometimes the greatest dangers are the ones that stand quietly in the places we call safe. For 20 years, Charles Dawson lived among ordinary people, smiling at gatherings, attending vigils, all while carrying the weight of an unspeakable crime. What brought the truth forward was not chance. It was persistence. It was a sister who never stopped lighting candles for her family. It was detectives who refused to let a dusty file die on a shelf. And it was technology that gave new eyes to an old mystery, pulling secrets from the rivers. Depths that had been hidden for almost 2 decades. This case tells us that time can silence voices, but it cannot erase truth. Communities that refuse to forget, and investigators who refuse to stop, can turn even the darkest cold cases into stories of justice. The Matthews family may never return, but their legacy now speaks loudly across Oregon. A legacy that says, justice delayed is still justice delivered. And now, after this long journey through fog, river, and courtroom, the story closes. Yet the silence it leaves behind lingers cold, reminding us of how fragile trust can be, and how persistence can shine even in the darkest places. If you are still watching this story, it means it has touched you. That means it deserves your like. And your subscribe? Please help us complete 5,000 likes on this story, because that is the target set from my mother for you, and it is totally free. And tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this cold case story. Stay connected with Unscripted Tales, where we bring to light the stories that time tried to bury.